Okay, we're looking at our next section here, talking about under European rule, and we're going to look at the different places within this incorporation into European kind of colonial empires. Can definitely be a traumatic experience for a lot of people. The small scale societies, especially, we see loss of life, home, cattle, crops, all of those things that are a part of this. We see in 1902 a British soldier in East Africa describing a struggle that happened in a village where every soul was either shot or bayoneted. Um, Vietnamese elite, they schooled for centuries in the Chinese style of Confucianism. Conquest meant that the natural harmonies of life had been badly disrupted and that water flowed uphill in their terms. And so we see some different aspects to it, but we also understand that there is some cooperation and rebellion that will take place from this. For cooperating groups, um, we see that there are some groups and individuals who cooperate willingly with their new masters. Um, Many men are going to find employment, status, and security in European armed forces. That becomes something that is definitely a part of this. We see the elite often keeping much of their status and their privileges throughout this time as well. So there's definitely some benefits to this too. Colonial governments and private missionary organizations have an interest in promoting kind of European education in a lot of ways. So we start to see that governments and the missionaries promote that education. There's a growth of a small class that has Western education, right? And those members will serve in colonial state, European businesses, Christian missionaries, and of those like. Governments are going to increasingly rely on this group as well, because of the fact that they are going to, it's going to be harder and harder for them to uh, keep one whole group on this. So we start to see that we start to see that these smaller groups who become Western educated are going to be relied upon by the European governments. There are some periodic rebellions that take place during this time as well. There is a um, some of the rebellions that we look at are uh, some small, some large. The most famous one is the Indian Rebellion in 1857 and 1858. This is going to trigger the introduction into the colony's military forces, a new kind of cartridge smeared with animal fat from cows and pigs. And because Hindus venerated cows and Muslims regard pigs as unclean, both groups view the innovation as a plot to render them either defiled or to convert them to Christianity. So we see that this rebellion that takes place and it's all based off of a series of disagreements and grievances. The Indian Rebellion really begins as a mutiny among Indian troops, yeah, and rebel leaders are going to advocate the revival of the Mughal Empire during this time. What does it do? It really will widen the racial divide. The British are less tolerant of the Native people, excuse me, not Native Americans, the Native Indian people in India, and it really leads to the British government to assume direct control over India itself. So we see the changes that exist within this. Um, Colonial empires with a difference. So at one level, you have European colonial empires were the latest in a very long line of imperial creations that would have to enlist cooperation and experience resistance from their subjects. Within this time period, the 19th century, um, we are looking at kind of a superior ruled group here. So as the high tide of scientific racism in Europe coincides with the acquisition of Asian and African colonies. In East Africa, white men are expected to be addressed as Bwana, okay, which is Swahili for master. And Europeans regularly called African men boy. And it's affected by European racism, where those who had Western education and aspirations most clearly threatened the racial divide. So when we look at this, there's a proposal in 1883 to allow Indian judges to hear cases involving whites. This promotes outrage and massive demonstrations among European inhabitants that were in India. Um, when we look more into this, the colonial empires, we see race as prominent amongst this whole thing. And racism is especially pronounced in areas where there's a large number of European settlers. So, for instance, in South Africa, and that stays that way for a very long time. Colonial states will impose some very big changes in people's daily lives as well with this. So, settler population experiencing and the expression of the racial distinctions was much more pronounced than in places like Nigeria, which had very few white settlers. And so we know that was a big part of this. South African whites attempt the impossible task of kind of creating and industrializing the economy based on cheap African labor while limiting their social ideals. We look at the ability to penetrate societies that they govern, tax systems that become a part of this as well. We look into things like the global network of exchange, the public health, sanitation measures. All that touches the daily lives of many people when you see the changes there. 19th century, you have European colonizers are extraordinary, as well as penchant for counting and classifying the subject people. So we see in India an appropriated and idealized caste system. In Africa, it identifies or invents distinct tribes within this time. The notion of a tribal Africa will express the Western view of African societies as very primitive and very backward in a lot of ways. Gender is also going to play a role. Colonizers take a lot of pride in this idea behind masculinity. They call it active masculinity while defining the conquered races as soft, passive, and feminine. They linked the gender ideology and racial prejudice to support colonial rule in a lot of ways. And European women they're seen as emblems of civilization. So some colonized people like the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, the Kamba, the Hausa, they were gendered as masculine or martial races at this time and recruit into security forces as well. So you start to see those being promoted. And then we also have the idea behind colonial policies contradicting European core values and practices at home. So colonies are essentially dictatorships at this point in time. Very much the antithesis of that national independence that was rallying, the nationalism view that was rallying a lot of countries. Racial classifications go against the Christian and Enlightenment ideals of human equality as well. But again, colonization changes that kind of page. Many colonizers were against spreading modernization to the colonies. They did not want those secrets getting out as to how this happened. So in time, you see visible contradictions in European behavior that would help to undermine the foundations of colonial rule. In this portrait here, you see a European gentleman, a young European gentleman, attended to by multiple servants in colonial India, illustrates the kind of exalted status of the Europeans in a colonial setting and the sharp racial divide that existed at that time. Okay, ways of working comparing colonial economies here. when we look into this portion of things, and we got quite a bit to go here, guys, but we're looking at economics of coercion, forced labor, and the power of state. So we're looking first at the ways of working, comparing colonial economics. Colonial rule is going to affect the lives of its subjects in a lot of different ways, but the most pronounced change was their working. The colonial state has the power to tax, seize land for European enterprises, compel labor, build railroads, ports, all of the above. And it plays a very important role in the transformation. Even more powerful was the growing integration that colonizers had in societies into the world economy. And that was a huge part of these things here. To various degrees, kind of the old ways of working were eroded almost everywhere in the colonial world. Subsistence farming, in which peasant families produce largely for their own needs, diminished as you have growing numbers that direct at least some of the energies to working for wages or selling what they produce for cash and income and things like that. Within the economics of coercion, forced labor, power, and state, we're looking at this idea of unpaid labor. Many colonial states demand unpaid labor on public projects. In French Africa, all natives were legally obligated to do statute labor for 10 or 12 days a year. And that practice lasted all the way through 1946. It was definitely resented. A resident from British West Africa interviewed in 1996 recalls this feature of colonial life here. And he says, they, meaning the British officials, were rude and they made us work for them a lot. They came to the village and just rounded us up and made us go off and clear the road or carry loads on our heads. So that's a quote from one of those residents within British West Africa. The worst abuses are going to take place in the Congo Free State. It's governed by King Leopold of Belgium. Private companies in the Congo that operate under the authority of the state would force villagers to collect rubber, which was in much demand for things like bicycle and automobile tires. There was a reign of terror and abuse that began in the 1890s there as well that existed. Forced labor is also going to cause widespread starvation as people couldn't grow their own crops. That becomes a huge part of this as well. And we see that Belgium finally stepped in and took control of the Congo in 1908 to kind of stop those abuses that were taking place. One refugee is going to remember from the horrors, and this is in your book, I'm reading from your book here. We were always in the forest to find rubber vines to go without food, and our women had to give up cultivating the fields and gardens. Then we starved. We begged the white men to leave us alone, saying we could get no more rubber, but the white men and the soldiers said, go, you are only beasts yourselves. When we failed and our rubber was short, the soldiers came to our towns and killed us. Many were shot. Some had their ears cut off. Others were tied up with ropes around their neck and taken away. So the private colony that Leopold has and his reign of terror comes to that end in 1908 to kind of stop the abuses there. We have a system known as the cultivation system in the Netherlands. It happens during the 19th century, so the 1800s, where peasants are required to cultivate 20% or more of their land in cash crops, things like sugar and coffee, to meet their tax obligation to the state. The proceeds are going to be sold for very high profits, and it's financed by Dutch industrialization. That is using very cheap labor. They're using the crops for free that they're getting and turning a profit on them. It enriches the traditional authorities who enforce the system as well. And it really leads to a deadly wave of famines within places like Java. Okay? They have the obligations of producing this, and they are not necessarily producing food for themselves. The resistance that we see, we'll see it happen quite a bit. Many areas resisted the forced cultivation of cash crops. German East Africa is going to be one of these places. where we see a major rebellion in 1905 against the forced cotton cultivation that existed there. 1904, 1905, the Maji Maji, they persuade the Germans to end the forced growing of cotton, and those colonized people could then alter or frustrate the plans of the colonizers themselves. In this portrait here, okay, also in your book, this is of mutilated children. This has an important impact on the public opinion about imperial rule in the Congo Free State. So as these pictures come out, people start to see the horrors that existed. And they symbolize the widespread abuses, including things like murder, rape, starvation, all of the above. And they associated with efforts to obtain supplies of wild rubber for use in industrialized societies. So we start to see the changes within this progress, or within the programs here. Ways of working, okay, kind of comparing the colonial economies. And we're looking at economies of cash crop agriculture, all right? And we're talking about a pull market. Many people are very happy to increase production for world markets. That's not necessarily a problem. There is some considerable profit to small farmers in areas like Irrawaddy, in the Irrawaddy Delta, in the Mekong Delta, which is French-ruled Vietnam rice cultivation. You'll see significant environmental damage to things like local fish, shellfish, food sources. It produces things like methane gas and contributes to issues such as global warming there. In the southern Gold Coast of Ghana, African farmers took the initiative to kind of develop export agriculture. So you have a leading supplier of cacao by 1911 here. And the problem was the labor shortages that are going to exist at this point in time. The exploitation of former slaves, men marrying women for their labor power, and influx migrants that create big tension within the Gold Coast and mainly Ghana there. Many colonies are going to also specialize in one or two cash crops that would create some type of dependence upon that cash crop there. So looking at the economies of wage labor, kind of the migration for work. Wage labor in European enterprises is very common. Both colonized regions from places like China and Japan, we see this happen quite a bit. African migrants will move in several directions. The Atlantic slave trade obviously is one of those directions for much of the 19th century, moving across into places like the Americas. There's an integral migration growing within European empires as well at this point in time. Europeans are going to take over really large tracts of African land, and they employ Africans as workers. Gold, diamond mines in South Africa provide employment in very harsh conditions. Okay, but the British view it as its employment. For Asian migrants, you're going to see them, some 29 million Indians and 19 million Chinese who are going to migrate, working on plantations that will finance Europe at this point in time. Okay, so sorry, I lost my point there. But in Asia, we had there's 29 million Indians, 19 million Chinese who are going to come in. They'll work on plantations that are financed by Europeans, rather high death rates and harsh conditions that are within those areas. The British facilitate the migration of Indian labor to kind of far-flung territories of the empire, especially after the end of the slave trade. You see mines are another source of wage labor, but dangerous work there. And Chinese migrants also settle Manchuria as well. They participate in the gold rushes of Australia and California. You see people coming into Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, all limiting Chinese immigration in the late 19th century. Colonial cities will attract a lot of workers as well. They are seen as centers of opportunity. Definitely going to be unsanitary, overcrowded in a lot of ways, and they segregate them too. Meaning they that different groups live in different areas. So an Asian population might live in one spot, an African population might live in another. So there's definite segregation. But it does create a place for native Western education for a middle class society that might be there. And you have an enormous class of this urban kind of poor people, excuse me, urban poor that could barely live and couldn't raise families either. So you see those issues that come along with the cities attracting the workers there. These are the workers at the Ceylon tea plantation in the early 20th century, moving sacks of tea into a drying house in preparation for export. The Lipton label on the bags is a reminder of the role of the large-scale foreign investment that was taking place here. That's it for today, guys. That'll conclude our lecture here. If you have any questions, by all means, go ahead and shoot me an email or post it on our Google Classroom, and we'll finish up with that. Have a good day, guys.